The jungle was dark, humid, and silent, until the searchers stumbled on something no one ever wanted to see. A piece of fabric, then clumps of hair, and finally, the unmistakable fragments of a human jawbone. It was the confirmation her family had dreaded. 27-year-old Charli Scott, 5 months pregnant, would never come home. But how did a young woman, excited to become a mother, end up the victim of such a brutal crime? And why did it take her own family, not the police, to uncover the truth? Today we go back to the beginning, when Maui was still a paradise for Charli Scott, until February 2014 turned it into a nightmare. This is the kind of story you don't just hear, you feel it. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you are watching from. The island of Maui is the kind of place most people dream of. Golden beaches stretch for miles, lush jungles breathe with the rhythm of the ocean, and the warm trade winds carry the scent of plumeria and salt. For visitors, it's paradise, a postcard-perfect escape from the rest of the world. For those who live there, though, it's something more intimate, a place where life feels slower, simpler, and deeply connected to both land and sea. For 27-year-old Charli Jo Scott, Maui was more than home, it was her anchor. She'd grown up there, surrounded by family, friends, and the beauty of the island. Charli was a free spirit with a love for animals, art, and laughter. People remembered her as vibrant, quirky, and full of life. She was fiercely loyal to those she loved, always willing to put others before herself. And in 2014 she was about to step into what she thought would be her greatest adventure yet: motherhood. Charli wasn't married. Her relationship with the baby's father, Stephen Capobianco, had been complicated, tumultuous even. But she had made peace with that. She knew she didn't need Stephen to be happy or fulfilled. What she needed was her growing child, her family, and the steady circle of friends who had always supported her. Pregnancy wasn't something she had planned, but it didn't scare her either. If anything, it gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She began preparing for the arrival of her baby with a mixture of nervousness and joy, decorating her home, buying baby clothes, and talking endlessly with her mom, Kimberlyn, about the kind of parent she wanted to be. She imagined holding her baby for the first time, teaching them to walk, and sharing with them the quiet magic of Maui, the way the waves crash at Ho'okipa Beach, the scent of eucalyptus along winding mountain roads, the feeling of barefoot evenings in the sand. Her family was thrilled for her. Kimberlyn, her mother, often said Charli was born to be a mom. She had that natural warmth, that instinctive ability to nurture. When she wasn't preparing for her own child, she was doting on her pets, dogs that she treated more like family members than animals. They were her companions, her protectors, her joy. But beneath all this excitement, there was tension that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. Charli's relationship with Stephen had always been troubled. Though they weren't together anymore, the pregnancy bound them in ways neither could escape. Friends later recalled overhearing Stephen make bitter remarks about not wanting to be a father. He had a reputation for being controlling, self-centered, even cruel at times. Charli, however, wasn't the type to live in fear. She tried to see the best in people, even in Stephen. She believed things could be managed if she stayed calm, rational, and focused on the bigger picture, her baby's future. Her family worried though. They saw the way Stephen's presence lingered in Charli's life like a shadow. Kimberlyn often told her daughters to trust their instincts, to stay safe, to be cautious. But Charli was independent, determined to make her own way, and unwilling to let Stephen's negativity ruin her joy. By February of 2014, she was 5 months pregnant. Her belly had started to show. Strangers would smile when they saw her, sensing the glow of a woman expecting her first child. And though she carried the weight of an uncertain relationship with her baby's father, she radiated optimism. She had hope. She had plans. On the evening of February 9th, those plans took a backseat to something far more ordinary: her sister's birthday party. Family gatherings were important to Charli. They reminded her of how lucky she was to have such a tight-knit support system. That night was no different. There was laughter, cake, and the easy warmth that only comes from being surrounded by people who love you. No one there could have guessed what would come next, because within hours Charli would vanish. And the paradise she called home, the place where she had always felt safe, where she imagined raising her child, would transform into the backdrop of a nightmare. To understand the weight of what happened next, you have to understand the illusion of safety in a place like Maui. Violent crime was rare. The island's natural isolation, its close-knit communities, and its reputation for peace made people feel secure. The idea that someone could disappear there, someone young, pregnant, and loved, felt unthinkable. But Maui wasn't immune to darkness. And for Charli, that darkness would emerge not from a stranger lurking in the shadows, but from someone she already knew. Her life at 27 was a delicate balance between joy and vulnerability. She had dreams of the future, but she also carried the weight of an unresolved past. It was a collision course that no one around her recognized in time. When she hugged her family that night at her sister's birthday, it seemed like any other parting. "See you soon," she might have said. A phrase people throw out casually, assuming there will always be another day. But for Charli, there would not be another day. The following morning, silence would fall. A silence that her family instantly recognized as wrong. A silence that would stretch into panic, into desperation, and eventually into horror. But that night, as she laughed with her sister and savored the simple joys of family, Charli still believed in the promise of new life. She believed in her baby. She believed in the possibility of happiness. And she believed she still had time. At first glance, Stephen Capobianco didn't seem like the kind of man who would one day be at the center of Maui's most disturbing murder trial. He was young, charismatic in his own rough-edged way, and for a time Charli believed there was something redeemable in him. She wasn't naive. Those who knew her would tell you she had a sharp intuition and a strong sense of self. But like many young women, she had a tendency to look past flaws, to focus on potential rather than the darker truths staring back at her. Their relationship had been rocky almost from the start. Friends described Stephen as unpredictable, with a streak of arrogance that often made him difficult to deal with. He could be charming in public but dismissive and cold in private. His mood shifted easily, one day laughing, the next seething with anger. Charli, by contrast, was steady. She wasn't confrontational by nature. She preferred peace over conflict, often smoothing things over just to keep a sense of calm. That dynamic, however, gave Stephen room to assert himself in troubling ways. He wasn't known for patience or compromise. And when the news of Charli's pregnancy came, it struck him not with joy but with resistance. Pregnancy should have been a moment of transformation for both of them, but Stephen didn't see it that way. According to those close to Charli, he made it clear early on that he didn't want to be a father. He worried about responsibility, about the burden of raising a child, about how it would change his life. For Charli, the pregnancy was a surprise too, but not an unwelcome one. She saw it as an opportunity for growth, for meaning. She believed she could handle motherhood even if she had to do it largely on her own. But what struck her friends and family most was Stephen's coldness. He didn't share in her excitement. Instead, he grew distant, often making comments that chilled those around him. At one point, he reportedly told friends that having a baby would ruin his life. Another time, he hinted darkly that he wished the pregnancy would just go away. If these comments had come from a stranger, they might have been brushed off as cruel jokes. But coming from Stephen, they were unsettling. His volatility had been visible before. Outbursts of anger, manipulative behavior, and an obsession with control. Charli's mother, Kimberlyn, worried constantly. She had seen enough to know Stephen was not someone to be trusted fully. Kimberlyn often reminded her daughter to be cautious, to guard herself, to remember that her safety, and her baby's safety, came first. But like many mothers-to-be, Charli was trying to balance practicality with optimism. She wanted her child to know their father. She wanted, at the very least, to give Stephen the chance to rise to the occasion, to take responsibility, to be part of the child's life. This hopefulness, though, came at a cost. It meant Stephen still had access to her life, to her trust, and eventually, to her vulnerability. By early 2014, the two weren't a couple anymore, but they weren't entirely separate either. It was a fragile truce held together only by the baby that connected them. Charli kept her distance emotionally but tried to maintain enough contact so that Stephen wouldn't feel shut out. Their conversations often revolved around practicalities: the baby, the pregnancy, the logistics of co-parenting. But underneath, tension simmered. Stephen resented the reality that he couldn't escape. Charli sensed his hostility but believed she could manage it. She wasn't afraid of him, not yet. Still, friends later recalled moments where Stephen's words betrayed something darker. He would speak about the pregnancy not as a blessing but as a problem. He talked about his car, his money, his freedom, as though the baby was stealing from him before it was even born. For Charli, Maui itself was a source of comfort. It was hard to imagine that anything truly terrible could happen in a place so beautiful. The island was small, intimate, and familiar. Everyone seemed connected somehow, and violent crime felt like something that belonged to far-off cities, not to their quiet communities. That illusion of safety kept Charli grounded. Even when Stephen's behavior troubled her, she believed the island, her family, and her friends formed a safety net strong enough to keep her secure. What she didn't realize was that the very isolation that made Maui feel safe also made it dangerous. Once you left the populated towns and ventured into the winding jungle highways, the beaches with no lights, or the cliffs where waves crashed violently, there were few places to turn for help. A wrong step, or a wrong companion, could mean vanishing without a trace. One of the most telling reflections of Charli's character was how she treated her dogs. They weren't just pets to her, they were family. She doted on them endlessly, training them, feeding them, and letting them sleep close to her at night. Her friends often joked that she spoiled them more than she would spoil her child. But this detail, small as it seemed at the time, would later become critical. Because everyone who knew Charli understood one thing: she would never abandon her dogs. No matter what, they came first. It was this fact, her devotion to her pets, that would later send alarm bells ringing for her family when she disappeared. But in early February 2014, those dogs were simply part of the picture of her happy, expectant life. As the days ticked closer to mid-February, Charli's life looked deceptively normal. She was glowing from her pregnancy, surrounded by supportive family, and trying to believe Steven would eventually come around. But in hindsight, the cracks were everywhere. Steven's hostility, his resentment, his chilling remarks about the pregnancy, the way he viewed Charli not as the mother of his child, but as an obstacle to his freedom. What no one knew at the time was that these cracks were not just relationship struggles. They were signs of something far more dangerous, a mind preparing to do something unthinkable. Kimberlyn and Charli's sisters were protective, almost fiercely so. They kept close tabs on her, always checking in, always making sure she was okay. Charli appreciated the attention but often brushed it off. She didn't want to be treated as fragile. But Kimberlyn in particular couldn't shake her unease about Steven. She worried that his bitterness over the pregnancy would turn into something worse. She worried he might lash out in ways no one could predict. She didn't know that within days, her fears would be realized in the most horrifying way possible. As February 9th approached, Charli had no idea she was living her final days. She was focused on her baby, her family, and the celebration of her sister's birthday. On the surface, everything seemed stable. But beneath it, the cracks in her world were widening, fragile, jagged fractures that would soon split wide open. And when they did, Maui's paradise would be shattered forever. The date was February 9, 2014, a Sunday evening in Maui. The trade winds swept softly across the island, carrying with them the briny scent of the ocean and the music of palm leaves rustling against each other. It was the kind of evening that reminded people why they loved living in Hawaii. Vibrant sunsets, laughter echoing through backyards, and families gathering together under strings of dimly lit bulbs. For the Scott family, this was not just another night. It was a birthday celebration, a chance to pause the rhythms of work, responsibility, and the constant preparation for a new baby. The gathering was for Charli's younger sister, and the mood was lighthearted, brimming with that easy familiarity that only siblings share. Charli, now 5 months pregnant, arrived with the unmistakable glow of expectant motherhood. Friends and relatives noticed it immediately, the way her cheeks flushed, the way she cradled her stomach without even realizing she was doing it. She moved with purpose and energy, chatting, laughing, snapping photos with family as though she had all the time in the world. No one there that night could have guessed it would be the last time they would ever see her alive. Inside the house, warmth radiated, not just from the humid Maui air but from the closeness of the Scott family. Kimberlyn, Charli's mother, bustled in and out of the kitchen, balancing trays of food and drinks, making sure everyone had what they needed. The sisters teased one another, slipping in private jokes that had been years in the making. It was the kind of party that was simple but memorable. Music in the background, plates piled high with food, the sound of children playing outside, and bursts of laughter breaking out over shared stories. Charli seemed especially happy that night. She talked openly about her pregnancy, answering questions about how she felt, whether she knew the baby's gender yet, and what name she was considering. The answers weren't all set in stone, but her excitement was undeniable. She was preparing, building dreams in her mind of what life as a mother would look like. For Kimberlyn, watching her daughter was bittersweet. She still worried about the future, about Steven's presence in Charli's life, and about how her daughter would manage as a single mom. But in those hours, surrounded by laughter and celebration, those worries melted into the background. Tonight, Kimberlyn wanted to see her daughter happy, and she did. Though the night felt joyful, there were subtle tensions simmering beneath the surface. Charli hadn't invited Steven. He wasn't part of this celebration, and that was intentional. By February, most of the Scott family saw him as a problem, Unreliable, self-centered, and perhaps even dangerous in ways they couldn't fully articulate. Charli didn't want conflict that night, so she didn't mention him much. But she did confide in her sister, in small fragments, about how difficult things had been. Stephen's resentment about the pregnancy lingered, and though she didn't want to dwell on it, she admitted it wore her down. Still, Charli insisted she could handle it. She was strong, she reminded them. She wasn't afraid of Stephen, not really. She had her family behind her, and that made her feel safe. What no one realized at the time was that Stephen had already begun weaving himself into the story of that night. Later, his presence would become central, even though he wasn't physically at the party. One of the most haunting artifacts of the evening is a photograph, one of the last ever taken of Charli. In it, she's smiling, her eyes alight with the joy of family and the anticipation of motherhood. She's dressed casually, her hair loose around her shoulders, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly. Her family treasures that image now, but at the time it was just another snapshot, destined for a family album. No one thought it would become a relic, the frozen evidence of the last moments before everything unraveled. As the night wore on, guests trickled out, and the energy in the house began to quiet. Charli hugged her sisters tightly, promised to call them the next day, and helped tidy up a few things before heading out. She was expected home, where her dogs waited for her. The dogs were always in her mind, never left alone for too long. And though she didn't voice it, she was also aware of Stephen. The fragile truce between them meant she sometimes needed to respond to his requests, to meet up when he needed something. That night, after leaving the party, she would answer one such request. According to Stephen, his car had broken down along the Hana Highway. He needed her help. It wasn't unusual for Charli to step in when others needed her. She was reliable, generous, and quick to offer assistance, even when it was inconvenient. Her family knew this about her. But had they known she would go out to meet Stephen that night, they would have begged her not to. The Hana Highway is not the kind of place you want to find yourself after dark. Winding through the dense jungle of Maui, it is both beautiful and treacherous, famous for its sharp curves, single-lane bridges, and sheer cliffs that drop into the roaring Pacific below. For tourists, it is a thrilling drive. For locals, it is a road to be respected. Even in daylight, it demands caution. At night it can be perilous. Somewhere along that road, Stephen claimed his car had stalled. Somewhere along that road, Charli drove into the darkness, her headlights cutting through the mist, unaware she was driving straight into a trap. The Scott family didn't know it then, but their goodbyes that night would be their last. The laughter, the hugs, the warmth, they were the final notes of Charli's life before it descended into chaos. The next morning, when Kimberlyn tried to reach her daughter and got no response, the unease began. By the time they realized her dogs were left alone in the house and her car was missing, that unease had turned into panic. But in that moment, on the night of February 9th, none of them could see the storm coming. They had only the image of Charli smiling at her sister's birthday party, carrying her unborn child, full of hope. Looking back, it's impossible not to see the foreshadowing in that night. The happiness was real, but it was layered with the unspoken tensions of Charli's relationship with Stephen. The Hana Highway, so central to the events that would unfold, was already written into the story before anyone could recognize its significance. The family's final memories of Charli are now tinged with sorrow. What was once a night of celebration has become a night that haunts them, the dividing line between the life they knew and the nightmare that followed. By answering Stephen's call for help, Charli unknowingly set the course for her disappearance. It wasn't her fault, her family insists on this. She was simply being who she always was, compassionate, reliable, willing to help. But that night, her kindness collided with Stephen's resentment. And somewhere between the party and the darkened stretches of the Hana Highway, paradise was shattered. The morning of February 10, 2014, began like any other on Maui. The sun rose over the Pacific, painting the horizon with streaks of pink and gold. Waves pounded rhythmically against the shore, a sound both soothing and eternal. For the Scott family, mornings were usually a time of routine. Coffee brewing, dogs being walked, phone calls exchanged between sisters. But on this particular morning, silence hung in the air like a warning. Charli Scott, the daughter, sister, friend, and soon-to-be mother, was nowhere to be found. It was Kimberlyn, Charli's mother, who first sensed something was wrong. She was used to hearing from her daughter in some way, even if just a short text. Charli wasn't the type to vanish off the radar. By mid-morning, Kimberlyn picked up her phone and dialed Charli's number. It rang, but no one answered. She tried again and again, listening to the voicemail greeting she knew so well. Each unanswered call chipped away at the fragile assumption that everything was fine. She must still be asleep, Kimberlyn told herself at first, but something inside her bristled with unease. Charli was 5 months pregnant. Pregnant women didn't just go quiet, not when they had families hovering protectively around them, and certainly not Charli, who doted on her dogs like they were children themselves. By noon, Kimberlyn's worry had turned to dread. Her sister Heather drove to Charli's home to see if she was there. The sight that greeted her was unsettling. The door was locked, but inside, one of Charli's dogs whimpered restlessly. The other was gone. Charli's car was missing too. Heather pressed her face against the window. She could see the dog pacing inside, nails clicking against the floor. It wasn't like Charli to leave them. She was fiercely protective of her pets, to the point of refusing to take overnight trips unless someone she trusted completely could care for them. If she had left, she would have left instructions. Food. A note. Something. But there was nothing. Heather called her mother. Something's not right. By mid-afternoon, the Scott household was in a state of quiet panic. Kimberlyn gathered her daughters and they spoke in hushed voices, each trying to make sense of the situation. Had Charli gone to spend the night at a friend's? Had she decided to take a drive, maybe clear her head? None of it made sense. Not with her dogs left behind. Not with her being pregnant. And then came the detail that turned worry into outright alarm. The other dog. Charli's second dog was missing, and not just missing, it seemed to have vanished with her. Kimberlyn's heart sank. She knew her daughter. She knew Charli would never, under any circumstances, leave her dogs behind unless something was very, very wrong. When the family called the police, desperate for help, they expected urgency. They expected sirens, a team of officers, the beginning of a search. But what they received was indifference. She's an adult, the officers explained. Maybe she just needed some space. She'll probably turn up. Kimberlyn was stunned. Her daughter was pregnant. 5 months along. This wasn't a teenager sneaking off for a weekend or someone taking an impromptu vacation. This was a responsible woman who had just been seen at a family birthday party the night before. She had plans. She had responsibilities. She had a baby on the way. But the officers shrugged. They didn't see an emergency. To Kimberlyn it felt like a slap in the face. For mothers, instinct is rarely wrong. Kimberlyn knew her daughter's patterns. Charli wasn't perfect, she had her struggles, but she was consistent. She called, she texted, she checked in. She had a change of plans, she said so. The silence was unnatural. It was terrifying. Kimberlyn replayed the last night in her head. The birthday party. Charli's laughter. The way she'd hugged everyone before leaving. There had been no signs of trouble, no warnings. And yet now, only hours later, her daughter seemed to have evaporated from the island. Something terrible had happened. Kimberlyn was sure of it. Every minute that passed without Charli's voice on the other end of the phone felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. The family understood something that police seemed unwilling to admit. When someone vanishes, the first 24 to 48 hours are critical. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. Opportunities are lost. But here they were, already losing precious time. Kimberlyn pleaded with officers, but they dismissed her concerns. It wasn't until much later, after evidence began surfacing, after the story gained traction, that police would acknowledge what was clear from the beginning. Charli Scott hadn't just wandered off. She had been taken. It was one of Charli's sisters who remembered the Life 360 app. Installed on Charli's phone, it tracked her location in real time. For a family now forced to act as its own detectives, this was the first real lead. When they opened the app, the last ping appeared, the Hannah Highway. A chill went through them. The Hannah Highway was notorious, not just for its breathtaking beauty but for its danger. Narrow, winding, carved into cliffs with no guardrails, it was not the kind of road to be stranded on at night. Had her car broken down? Had she crashed? Was she stranded out there, hurt and waiting for help? The thought was unbearable. With police still refusing to act, the Scotts turned to social media. They posted about Charli's disappearance, shared her photo, begged for help. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Friends, neighbors, even strangers mobilized. Volunteers gathered, ready to search. The family's living room became a command center. Maps of Maui were spread across tables, markers circling areas of interest. Phone calls went out. Supplies were gathered, flashlights, food, water. They weren't going to wait for an official investigation. They were going to find Charli themselves. By nightfall on February 10th, the silence was deafening. No calls. No texts. No sign of Charli. Kimberlyn lay awake, listening to the night sounds outside her window, haunted by the thought of her daughter alone somewhere, calling for help that wasn't coming. In her heart, she knew Charli wasn't just missing. Something darker had happened. Something intentional. The silence wasn't absence. It was evidence. The events of that morning would come to define the rest of the search. The locked house. The crying dog. The missing car. The indifference of police. And most chilling of all, the ping from the Hana Highway, the place where paradise would soon reveal its darkest secrets. The family didn't know it yet, but the pieces were already in motion. The dog would be found. The car would be found. And in the days to come, the fragments of a horrific truth would surface. But in that moment all they had was silence. And the gnawing certainty that time was running out. The Hana Highway is not just a road, it is an ordeal. Stretching along Maui's rugged northeastern coastline, the narrow two-lane pass is a gauntlet of 617 sharp turns and nearly 61 lane bridges, with cliffs that drop straight into the Pacific. For tourists it's an adventure. For locals, it's a lifeline between small, isolated communities. For the Scott family, it was now the site of their greatest fear. When the Life 360 app pinged Charli's last location somewhere along this treacherous stretch, it gave the family a focus. But it also raised a terrifying possibility. What if Charli had gone off the road? What if she was trapped in her car, bleeding, hidden in the jungle below the cliffs? The clock was ticking and no one official was looking for her. So the family and volunteers went themselves. It was just before dawn when the first cars began lining up along the Hana Highway. Headlights cut through the mist, casting beams across the wet pavement. The air smelled of salt, rain, and ginger flowers blooming in the underbrush. Dozens of people stepped out with flashlights, backpacks, and determination etched across their faces. Some were friends of Charli, others complete strangers who had seen posts on Facebook and felt compelled to help. Kimberlyn stood among them, holding a photo of her daughter. "This is where her phone last pinged," she said, pointing at the map on her car hood. "If she's out here, we're going to find her." It was the kind of resolve only a mother could muster. Searching the Hana Highway wasn't as simple as walking down a road. The terrain was brutal, dense jungle on one side, sheer cliffs on the other. Every few hundred feet, the volunteers had to stop, peer down into ravines, or push through tangled vines and ferns taller than their heads. The sounds of the forest were alive around them. The croak of bullfrogs, the chirp of crickets, the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. At times, the silence was worse, when the only sound was the wind moving through the trees, whispering secrets no one wanted to hear. Each volunteer carried a silent question. Would they be the one to find her? And if they did, what condition would she be in? The first real breakthrough came when a pair of searchers spotted movement up ahead. Out from the brush came a small, familiar figure. Charli's dog, the one that had been missing from her house. The relief was overwhelming, at least for a moment. Kimberlyn rushed forward, calling the dog's name. The animal wagged her tail, ears pinned back, happy but trembling. But as the family knelt to comfort the dog, a chilling realization struck them. Her paws were clean. The Hana Highway was mud-slick and the jungle floor was soaked with rain. If the dog had walked 13 miles from where the phone last pinged, she would have been caked in dirt and leaves. But she wasn't. Which meant only one thing. Someone had driven her there. The discovery twisted relief into horror. The dog's survival wasn't just luck. It was a clue. A deliberate act. Someone had taken the animal away from the scene, alive. And if they had done that, what had they done to Charli? As the day wore on, another discovery sent a shiver through the searchers. Charli's forerunner, once a familiar sight around town, was found 20 miles further down the Hana Highway. But it wasn't intact. The SUV had been torched, reduced to a blackened skeleton of metal and ash. Its windows shattered, its interior gutted. The once recognizable vehicle was now nothing more than a smoking question mark. Fire had consumed whatever evidence might have been inside. Or maybe that was the point. When Kimberlyn saw the remains, she felt her knees weaken. She loved this car, she whispered. She never would have left it like this. The reality was undeniable. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase something. Near the phone's last ping, deeper into the jungle, the searchers found more chilling fragments of Charli's life. First, there was a blanket, one she often carried in her car. It was crumpled, dirt-stained, but recognizable. Then came clothing, her skirt and shirt, torn and riddled with knife holes, all clustered around the stomach area. The symbolism was unbearable. Someone hadn't just attacked Charli, they had targeted her pregnancy, her unborn child. Nearby, a volunteer spotted a small metallic glint, Charli's tongue piercing, lying in the mud. To anyone else, it might have been just another piece of jewelry. But to Kimberlyn it was a gut punch. Her daughter would never have taken it out voluntarily. Piece by piece the forest was revealing a story. And it was one drenched in violence. By now the volunteers moved with a heavier pace. Their search wasn't for a stranded woman anymore. It was for a victim. Still, Kimberlyn refused to give in completely. "We don't know," she insisted to her daughters. "Maybe she's hurt, maybe someone took her, she could still be alive." But her voice cracked, betraying the truth she didn't want to admit. The evidence suggested otherwise. The family returned home that night with heavy hearts. The dog lay curled in Kimberlyn's lap, whining softly, as if she too carried the weight of what had been lost. It wasn't until after the car was found, after the clothing and the jewelry surfaced, that the police finally began to take the case seriously. What the family had feared all along was now undeniable. Charli Scott hadn't simply disappeared. She had been the victim of a violent crime. Detectives swarmed the area, photographing the burned-out SUV, marking evidence with little orange flags, taking statements from the family who had done the work they had refused to do. But to Kimberlyn their sudden interest felt hollow. Where were they yesterday? Where were they when her daughter might still have been alive? The Hannah Highway is beautiful, yes, but it is also merciless. It hides what it chooses to hide. Cars vanish into ravines, their wreckage swallowed by vines. Waves crash against jagged rocks, carrying secrets out to sea. And now it seemed it had swallowed Charli Scott. The family stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring into the endless expanse of ocean. Somewhere out there, or deep in the jungle, was the truth. But the truth wasn't ready to be found. Not yet. The road to Hannah had given them fragments, enough to confirm their worst fears, but not enough to tell the full story. That story was still waiting, buried in shadows, to be unearthed piece by piece. As the search stretched into the night, Kimberlyn clutched Charli's photograph against her chest. The dog whimpered at her feet. Around them, volunteers lit lanterns and torches, their glow flickering like stars scattered on the jungle floor. The family had found proof of violence, yes. They had found evidence of a crime. But they hadn't found Charli. And until they did, there was still a sliver of hope. Hope that clung stubbornly against the rising tide of dread. What they didn't yet know was that the road had only begun to tell its story. More discoveries were coming. Darker, more conclusive. And when they arrived, they would shatter what little hope remained. The jungle doesn't give up its secrets easily. It swallows, conceals, and waits, sometimes forever. But when it does decide to speak, the things it reveals can be unbearable. By the time volunteers returned to the Hannah Highway for the second day of searching, the Scott family already knew this was no ordinary disappearance. The torched SUV, the clean-pawed dog found far from home, the shredded clothing marked with knife holes, it all painted a picture of deliberate violence. But they didn't yet know how much darker that picture was about to become. The searchers fanned out again, pushing deeper into the dense rainforest. The Hannah jungle is a world unto itself, humid, tangled, alive with the buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen creatures. Thick vines hung like ropes from banyan trees. Every step seemed to pull them into another world, far away from the sunny beaches that tourists imagined when they thought of Maui. The sound of machetes cutting through brush echoed as volunteers hacked narrow paths. Others crouched low, scanning the ground for anything out of place. Scraps of fabric, disturbed earth, tire tracks. They were not police officers, not trained detectives. They were mothers, fathers, neighbors, surfers, and teachers. But they were relentless because what they were looking for wasn't evidence. It was Charli. It was a volunteer who saw it first, a flash of something pale against the dark soil. He knelt down, brushed aside a layer of damp leaves and froze. It was hair. Long strands tangled together in a clump, unmistakably human. When he called the others over, silence spread across the group like a heavy fog. Everyone knew Charli's distinctive hair. It was thick, dark, and flowing, the kind of hair people remembered. And now it was lying here on the jungle floor, torn from her head. Kimberlyn's breath caught in her chest when she saw it. Her knees buckled and she had to steady herself against a tree. That's my daughter's," she whispered, her voice cracking. This was no accident. No car crash. Someone had brought her here, someone had harmed her here. The forest was beginning to speak and its voice was cruel. A little farther along, another volunteer noticed something glinting in the mud. She crouched, brushed the soil aside and recoiled in horror. They were fingernails. Torn, jagged, smeared with dirt. For a moment, no one could move. The implications were brutal. Fingernails didn't just fall off. They were ripped out, often in a struggle, often in an act of desperation. Kimberlyn turned away, covering her mouth as tears spilled down her face. She imagined her daughter fighting, clawing for her life, leaving behind these broken fragments as proof of her resistance. The volunteers stood in stunned silence. They weren't just piecing together a crime scene. They were piecing together Charli's final moments. The worst discovery came later in the day, when searchers pushed deeper into a ravine near the last Life 360 ping. It was a small bone fragment at first, half buried in the soil. Then another and another. Finally, something larger, curved, unmistakable, chilling. A piece of a human jawbone. The volunteers froze. No one wanted to touch it, but no one could look away. The reality of what they were dealing with finally came crashing down. This wasn't just a missing person. This was a murder. Kimberlyn stood at the edge of the ravine, her face pale, her body shaking. She didn't need dental records to tell her what she already knew. She felt it deep in her bones. This was Charli. Her daughter wasn't coming home. Up until this point, the search had carried with it a faint thread of hope. As unlikely as it seemed, there had been a chance that Charli was alive, injured, kidnapped, held somewhere against her will. But with the discovery of human remains, that thread snapped. The air grew heavier, the jungle quieter. Volunteers who had come to help find a missing woman now found themselves staring at the aftermath of a brutal killing. Some wept openly. Others turned away, unable to process the horror of what lay in the soil. For Kimberlyn, the grief was immediate and suffocating. Yet alongside the grief came a fierce, burning anger. Whoever had done this had not just killed her daughter, they had tried to erase her, to scatter her into pieces and hide her in the earth. But the jungle had betrayed them. It had kept its secrets for a while, yes. But now it was speaking one fragment at a time. The evidence forced the Maui Police Department to finally act. What they had dismissed as an overreaction by a worried mother was now undeniably a homicide investigation. Detectives arrived in force, their presence belated but unavoidable. Yellow crime scene tape went up. Evidence markers dotted the jungle floor. Forensic teams began carefully collecting every scrap of hair, every fragment of bone, every torn piece of fabric. But to the family it was too little, too late. Had the police taken Charli's disappearance seriously from the beginning, perhaps some part of her might have been saved. Now all they had were fragments. That night, Kimberlyn returned home with her surviving daughters. The weight of the discovery pressed down on all of them. Her house was filled with reminders of Charli, her clothes folded in the laundry basket, her makeup on the bathroom counter, her laughter still echoing faintly in the walls. The emptiness was unbearable. The dog, the one they had found alive on the Hannah Highway, padded softly through the house. She stopped at the door, whining as if waiting for Charli to walk in. Kimberlyn broke down completely, collapsing to her knees, clutching the dog in her arms. Her daughter was gone. Her grandchild was gone. And the only thing left was a burning need for justice. The Hannah jungle had spoken. It had revealed enough to destroy hope, enough to force the police into action, enough to confirm that a crime had taken place. But it hadn't revealed everything. There were still missing pieces. Where was the rest of Charli's body? Who had done this to her? And why? The family knew the answers were out there, somewhere along those twisting roads and hidden ravines. The jungle had given them fragments. Now it was up to investigators, and the family themselves, to stitch those fragments into the truth. As night fell, Kimberlyn lit a candle for her daughter. The flame flickered in the darkness, fragile but defiant. "This isn't over," she whispered. "We're going to find out what happened to you. And we're going to make sure he pays." Though she hadn't yet spoken his name, she already knew who he was. The baby's father. Charli's ex-boyfriend. The man who had everything to lose by her pregnancy. The jungle had opened its mouth and whispered the beginning of the story. Now it was time to drag the rest into the light. The discoveries in the jungle left no doubt. Charli Scott had been murdered. But now came the harder question. Who had done it? The family didn't have to look far for an answer. In their minds, suspicion had always circled back to one person. The same man whose name Charli's mother, Kimberlyn, could barely bring herself to speak. Stephen Capobianco, the father of the child. To outsiders, Stephen was just Charli's ex-boyfriend. But to her family, he was something else entirely. The father of her unborn baby, a man whose presence had been a storm cloud over Charli's otherwise bright life. Their relationship had ended months before. By all accounts, Charli had moved on. She was excited to be a mother, even if she wasn't going to be raising her child alongside Stephen. But that very fact, that the baby would exist without him, was, to Stephen, a source of anger and resentment. He had been vocal about not wanting the pregnancy. Friends remembered him scoffing at the idea of being a dad, complaining that his life was already difficult enough without a child tying him down. To Kimberlyn, these words came back with haunting clarity once Charli disappeared. And now, with evidence of murder mounting, Stephen wasn't just the ex. He was the prime suspect. When questioned, Stephen's story was simple. Too simple. He told police that his car had broken down along the Hannah Highway on the night of February 9th. Stuck on the side of the road, he said, he called Charli for help. Charli, being the kind soul she was, agreed to drive out into the night to pick him up. She jumped his car, got it running again, and the two began driving back toward town, Stephen in his car, Charli following behind in hers. And then, according to him, her headlights disappeared. One moment they were there in his rearview mirror. The next they were gone. He assumed she had turned off somewhere, maybe decided to drive elsewhere. He didn't think much of it, he said. It was a story designed to make him look innocent. But it was also a story with holes big enough to drive a car through. Technology doesn't lie, and Stephen's phone records told a very different story than the one he gave investigators. Instead of breaking down briefly, being helped, and driving away, Stephen's phone placed him in the area for hours longer than he admitted. Even more damning, his phone pinged multiple times at the scene after he claimed to have left. It was as if he couldn't let the crime scene go. He kept circling back again and again like a moth to a flame. The timeline he gave the police didn't match the reality of the digital trail. And in homicide investigations, discrepancies like that are deadly. Even before the evidence began stacking up, Kimberlyn and her daughters suspected Stephen. They remembered how Charli had confided in them about his reaction to the pregnancy. How he'd grown colder, distant, and sometimes angry when she brought up the baby. How he made comments that unsettled her, comments she brushed off but that now seemed prophetic. One remark in particular haunted Kimberlyn, when Stephen had once told Charli that if she kept the baby, it would ruin his life. The family had always worried he might try to talk her out of it, pressure her, maybe even threaten her. But no one imagined it could escalate to this. And yet, with Charli gone and her unborn child lost with her, those words took on a chilling new weight. In the days following Charli's disappearance, Stephen didn't behave like a grieving father-to-be. He didn't join the searches in any meaningful way. He didn't appear distraught or desperate to find Charli. Instead, he projected indifference. At times, even irritation. When local reporters shoved microphones toward him, his tone was defensive, not devastated. He repeated the same alibi, insisting that he had nothing to do with it. His delivery was flat, almost rehearsed. For those watching, it didn't look like a man terrified for the mother of his child. It looked like a man terrified of being caught. Piece by piece, investigators built their case. The burned-out SUV found in a spot known for abandoned vehicles seemed staged, an attempt to erase evidence. But investigators could still trace its movements. The dog, found alive miles away, raised even more red flags. How could she have ended up so far from the last phone ping? And why were her paws spotless, as though she'd been driven there rather than running herself? The shredded clothing, pierced with knife holes clustered around the stomach, suggested a targeted attack. Not random violence, not a stranger. Someone had wanted to destroy not just Charli, but the child she carried. And who, investigators asked, had the strongest motive to erase that child from existence? As detectives dug deeper, friends of Stephen's came forward with disturbing recollections. They remembered comments he had made, half jokes, half confessions, that now seemed ominous. Remarks about not wanting to be trapped with a kid. Remarks about Charli being stubborn for going through with the pregnancy. Some friends recalled darker statements, chilling enough to make them question why they hadn't spoken up sooner. One friend recounted Stephen saying that if Charli ever tried to make him be a father, he'd make sure it didn't happen. At the time they had brushed it off as just talk. Now those words were evidence. The pressure on Stephen mounted. The police questioned him again and again, probing the inconsistencies in his story. They confronted him with phone records, with witness statements, with the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence. Each time he stuck to his script. The car broke down. Charli helped him. She drove away. He never saw her again. But with each retelling, the cracks widened. Small details shifted. The confidence in his voice faltered. Investigators could sense it, he was holding something back. Up until this point, the search for Charli had been led almost entirely by her family. Kimberlyn had organized the volunteers, rallied the community, and unearthed the very evidence that forced the police to act. But with the discovery of remains, with the inconsistencies in Stephen's alibi, with the chilling evidence pointing toward a deliberate killing, the Maui Police Department could no longer ignore the truth. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a murder investigation. And Stephen Capobianco wasn't just part of the story. He was the story. By the time the evidence from the jungle was processed and the phone records analyzed, investigators were ready to make their move. Stephen wasn't officially charged yet. But in the eyes of the police, the family, and much of the community, he was already guilty. He was the man who didn't want the baby. The man who lured Charli out onto a desolate highway in the middle of the night. The man whose story didn't match the facts. The man who, more than anyone else, had a reason to want Charli and her unborn child gone. As the investigation deepened, Stephen's world began to shrink. The noose was tightening, even if he didn't yet realize how close it was. The jungle had spoken. The family had refused to stay silent. And now the police were finally listening. The suspect had emerged. But proving his guilt, beyond the shadow of a doubt, would be the fight of their lives. For weeks, the island of Maui buzzed with rumors. The whispers in coffee shops, the murmurs in grocery store aisles, the unspoken question in every glance exchanged between neighbors was the same. When are they going to arrest him? Everyone knew who him was. By early summer 2014, the community's patience with the Maui Police Department was stretched thin. The gruesome discoveries in the jungle, the burned-out SUV, the dog found inexplicably miles from the scene, each new piece of evidence had only deepened the sense that something terrible had happened. And yet, days turned into weeks and weeks into months. No arrests. For Charli's family, the wait was unbearable. They had pieced together so much of the puzzle themselves, uncovering the very evidence that should have lit the fuse on an investigation. They had watched Stephen repeat his story with calm detachment, watched him live freely while they lived in agony, and still the police hesitated. What? Part of it came down to the nature of the evidence. Much of what they had was circumstantial. Knife holes in clothing, phone pings, fragments of remains. None of it was the smoking gun prosecutors crave. To build a case that could survive trial, investigators knew they needed to be meticulous. But for the family, and for a community already convinced of Stephen's guilt, caution looked like cowardice. On July 18, 2014, the tension finally broke. Early that morning, unmarked cars rolled quietly through a Maui neighborhood. Officers approached a modest home where Stephen Capobianco was staying. By now, they had gathered enough evidence, built enough of a narrative, and secured the warrants they needed. There was no dramatic chase, no violent confrontation. Just the slow, deliberate movements of officers who knew the eyes of an entire island were on them. When they led Stephen out in handcuffs, neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Some stepped onto porches, arms folded, watching the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. The man they had long believed to be guilty was finally facing justice. Word spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, the news had hit radio stations, then social media, then local television broadcasts. For many, it was the headline they had been waiting to see. Stephen Capobianco arrested in connection with the murder of Charli Scott. The reaction on Maui was immediate and visceral. On the island, everyone knows everyone. Maui isn't just a place you live. It's a network of connections, histories, and shared stories. Charli wasn't just a face on a missing poster. She was someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's friend. In many ways, she belonged to the entire community. So when Stephen was arrested, it felt personal. People gathered at local spots, cafes, beaches, roadside fruit stands, discussing the arrest in hushed, urgent tones. Some expressed relief. Others, anger that it had taken so long. Many worried that without a body, without more definitive proof, he might still slip through the cracks of the justice system. But one emotion united them all: vindication. They had known. They had always known. And now the law had finally caught up. For Kimberlyn Scott, the arrest was a moment of complicated relief. Standing before reporters, she did not gloat. She did not rejoice. Instead, she spoke with the measured, weary tone of a mother who had fought too hard and lost too much to ever celebrate. She thanked the community for their support. She reminded everyone that Charli and her unborn baby were still gone, that no arrest could bring them back, and that the fight was far from over. But there was steel in her voice too, a quiet defiance. The man she had long believed was responsible for her daughter's death was now behind bars, and she intended to see him stay there. Stephen, meanwhile, maintained his innocence. Through his attorney, he denied the charges and insisted he had nothing to do with Charli's disappearance. He stuck to his story. His car broke down, Charli helped him, and then she drove off into the night. In his first court appearance, he looked calm, almost detached. Some described his demeanor as smug, others as robotic. What struck many was what was missing: grief, fear. remorse. If he was an innocent man falsely accused of murdering the mother of his child, he showed none of the emotions one might expect. The arrest ignited a media frenzy. Local news outlets flooded the airwaves with updates, replaying footage of Stephen being led in cuffs. National networks soon picked up the story, framing it as a tragic tale of paradise turned nightmare. A young pregnant woman vanished in Maui's lush wilderness, a family forced to find the truth when police failed them, and an ex-boyfriend whose alibi was crumbling under scrutiny. Cameras turned to the Hana Highway, to the burned-out SUV, to the jungle where volunteers had discovered fragments of Charli's life and her body. Each location became part of the narrative, each image seared into the public imagination. And with every broadcast, public opinion hardened. Yet not everyone was convinced. Stephen still had his defenders, friends who believed he was being railroaded, acquaintances who thought the media had painted him guilty before a trial had even begun. Some argued that the case was built on circumstantial evidence, that without a body, the prosecution would struggle to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. In a small community, these divisions cut deep. Families argued at dinner tables. Strangers debated in grocery store lines. Was Stephen a cold-blooded killer, or a scapegoat for a community desperate for closure? The courtroom would ultimately decide. But outside, the court of public opinion was already in session. Despite the divisions, the arrest marked a turning point. For months, the case had felt like a wound left open, festering. With Stephen in custody, there was a sense, however fragile, that justice might finally be within reach. Search efforts quieted. The posters of Charli, still taped to telephone poles and pinned to bulletin boards, faded in the sun but now carried a new weight. They were no longer just pleas for help. They were memorials. And the family, though still grieving, could finally redirect their energy. They had brought Charli this far. Now it was time for the system to take over. As Stephen sat in jail awaiting trial, the island held its breath. For Kimberlyn and her family, the arrest was not an ending but another beginning. A long, grueling battle in court that would test them in ways they could hardly imagine. For the community, it was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how even in paradise, darkness could bloom. And for Stephen Capobianco, it was the beginning of the end of life as he knew it. Because from the moment those cuffs clicked shut, his story, and Charli's, was no longer just Maui's tragedy. It was the nation's. The courthouse in Wailuku, Maui, looked ordinary from the outside that day, just another government building set against the dramatic backdrop of the West Maui Mountains. But inside, history was unfolding. The trial of Stephen Capobianco was not just a case. It was an emotional storm, a reckoning for an island that had followed every twist in the saga of Charli Scott's disappearance. For 2.5 years, speculation had brewed, tempers had flared, and wounds had deepened. Now at last it was time for 12 jurors to decide. Was Stephen Capobianco guilty of murder and arson, or had he been unjustly accused? The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial in June 2016. Rows of benches were filled with journalists, community members, and family. Reporters clutched notepads, ready to transmit every detail back to the mainland. Camera crews camped outside, waiting to capture reactions. At the center of it all sat Stephen. He wore a collared shirt, his long hair pulled back neatly, his expression unreadable. The prosecution wasted no time painting the picture they wanted the jury to see. Stephen Capobianco did not want to be a father, the prosecutor began. So he did the unthinkable. He lured Charli Scott, 5 months pregnant with his child, to a desolate stretch of the Hana Highway. And there, in the darkness, he ended her life, and his unborn child's, because he wanted freedom. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the speaker. It was a chilling theory of motive wrapped in stark imagery. Stephen's defense team countered with equal force. Yes, Stephen was irresponsible. Yes, he wasn't the partner Charli deserved. But being a bad boyfriend does not make him a killer. The state has no body, no weapon, no eyewitness. This case is built on assumptions, on circumstantial evidence, and on emotions. That is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It was the first clash of what would become the longest and most expensive trial in Maui's history. Over the following weeks, the prosecution laid out their case piece by painstaking piece. Charli's clothing, found in the jungle with knife holes clustered around the belly. Her hair, fingernails, and jawbone fragments. The burned SUV discovered in a remote location known for dumping stolen cars. The testimony of volunteers who had found these items when police failed to search aggressively. Then came the digital evidence. Cell phone records showed Stephen in the Hana area long after he claimed to have left. GPS data placed him returning multiple times, contradicting his story. A Life 360 ping from Charli's phone was introduced, showing her last location before she vanished. The jury listened intently as an expert explained how those digital breadcrumbs didn't lie. Finally, there were the words Stephen himself had spoken in the aftermath, disturbing statements to acquaintances, where he expressed resentment over the pregnancy and fear of being trapped. Each piece of evidence was like a drop of water on stone. Small, perhaps, on its own, but together wearing away at Stephen's defense. Stephen's lawyers knew they had to sow doubt, to pull at the frayed edges of the prosecution's narrative. They attacked the lack of direct evidence. No body, no weapon, no eyewitness to the crime itself. They questioned the handling of physical evidence, pointing out that much of it had been found not by trained detectives but by desperate family members and volunteers. They tried to dismantle the timeline. Was it possible that Charli had disappeared under different circumstances? Could the burned car have been staged by someone else? They reminded the jury again and again that suspicion and certainty were not the same thing. And through it all, Stephen sat quietly, sometimes scribbling notes, sometimes staring blankly ahead. Never once shedding a tear. Never once displaying the anguish that Charli's family carried in every breath. Day after day, Kimberlyn Scott sat in the courtroom, her presence both an act of defiance and devotion. She had promised Charli she would never stop fighting for her, and this was the culmination of that vow. Reporters noted how Kimberlyn's face revealed every blow, every photograph, every piece of testimony that recalled the horror of what had been done to her daughter. She listened as forensic experts described wounds implied by the knife holes in Charli's skirt. She watched as the prosecution displayed her daughter's possessions, once intimate, everyday items, now treated as evidence in a murder trial. The courtroom became a crucible of pain, where grief and justice mingled in equal measure. What was supposed to be a straightforward proceeding stretched into months. Witness after witness was called, over 70 in total. Each one added a new layer of complexity, a new angle for the jury to weigh. The trial became the longest in Maui's history, dragging into December 2016. For the jurors, it was an endurance test. For Charli's family, it was agony relived, day after day. For the island, it was the story that dominated every headline, every conversation. And for Stephen, it was a slow drip of walls closing in. By the time closing arguments arrived, the jurors were weary, but the weight of the decision ahead of them was unmistakable. The prosecution delivered its final blow. Charli Scott is dead. Her baby is dead. The evidence shows Stephen Capobianco is the one responsible. You don't need to see the weapon. You don't need to have the entire body. You have enough. More than enough. Justice demands a guilty verdict. The defense pleaded for doubt. This is a case of tragedy, yes. But tragedy does not equal guilt. The state is asking you to convict a man on the basis of emotions and assumptions. If you have even the smallest doubt, you must acquit. When the jury filed out, the courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. It took days of deliberation. The jurors pored over the evidence, debated the inconsistencies, wrestled with the enormity of their choice. Finally, on December 28, 2016, they returned. The judge asked for the verdicts. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of arson. The words rang out in the courtroom like a hammer striking steel. Charli's family wept. Relief, sorrow, exhaustion all colliding at once. Kimberlyn closed her eyes, clutching the memory of her daughter like a talisman. Stephen remained impassive. No tears. No visible reaction. For Maui, the trial was over. But the story was not. Stephen was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The courtroom emptied, but the questions lingered. What had really happened on that dark night along the Hana Highway? Why had Stephen felt so threatened by fatherhood that he would resort to murder? And where was the rest of Charli's body? Even with a guilty verdict, the answers remained locked away with him. For Kimberlyn and the Scott family, the trial's conclusion was not closure, but a milestone. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law. But Charli was still gone. The baby she carried was gone. And the haunting truth was this: pieces of the story, like pieces of Charli herself, might never be found. The verdict had been read. The gavel had fallen. For many in Maui, the trial of Stephen Capobianco was over. But in the Scott household, there was no sense of an ending. Justice, Kimberlyn Scott knew, was not a single verdict or a sentence written into a judge's ledger. It was a living, breathing struggle, a shadow that followed her every day. And in that shadow, Stephen still loomed. When the jury declared Stephen guilty of second-degree murder and arson, reporters captured the moment Kimberlyn bowed her head in the gallery, tears streaming silently down her face. To outsiders, it might have looked like closure. To her, it was something else. It wasn't relief, she would later explain in an interview. It was the recognition that nothing about this was ever going to feel finished. We got a verdict, but we didn't get Charli. We didn't get her baby. We still don't know where she is. The conviction had settled the matter legally. But emotionally, the wound was raw, unhealed. Stephen never confessed. Not during the trial. Not after the sentencing. Not even when he faced life in prison. He sat stone-faced as the judge sentenced him, refusing to give Charli's family the one thing they needed most: the truth about what happened that night. In March 2017, Stephen Capobianco was formally sentenced. Life in prison with the possibility of parole after a minimum of 50 years. The courtroom was quieter this time, less packed with spectators but heavy with the presence of those who mattered most. Charli's sisters gave statements, their voices trembling as they spoke about birthdays missed, family photos with an empty space where Charli should have been, and the unborn nephew they would never meet. Kimberlin's voice was steadier, almost defiant. "You took my daughter from me. You took my grandchild. And you still can't even admit it. But we know what you did. And we will never stop saying her name." Stephen once again said nothing. He did not look at them. He did not apologize. He only asked his lawyers to file the paperwork for an appeal. It was no surprise when Stephen's defense team announced they would challenge the conviction. They argued that the trial had been tainted by media coverage, that the community of Maui was too small, too emotionally invested, to provide a truly impartial jury. They claimed the prosecution had leaned too heavily on circumstantial evidence, painting Stephen as a monster rather than proving him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. For the Scott family, it felt like reopening a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. The appeals process meant more hearings, more headlines, more public relitigation of Charli's life and death. Every time Stephen's name appeared in the news, it dragged Kimberlin back to the night her daughter vanished, to the mornings when she sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone, waiting for a call that never came. "Appeals are about him," she said bitterly. "They're about his rights, his chances, his future. But Charli doesn't get another chance. Her baby doesn't get another chance. Where's their appeal?" What gnawed at the family most was not the appeals themselves but the silence that accompanied them. Stephen could have spoken. He could have told investigators what happened to Charli's body, allowed her family to bring her home, to give her a proper burial. But he never did. Even after being convicted, even after knowing he would spend most, if not all, of his life behind bars, he clung to the silence. That silence became a second crime, one that lingered in the Scott household like an unwelcome guest. Without a full body, without clear answers, Kimberlin could not close the door on her daughter's story. "Every night," she admitted, "I lie awake thinking maybe if I went back to the jungle one more time, maybe if I searched one more mile along Hannah Highway, maybe I'd find her." That feeling never goes away. For the wider community, life continued. The headlines faded. New stories claimed the front pages. But in small pockets, the case remained a touchstone. In Hannah, locals still spoke in hushed tones about the night Charli disappeared. Hikers who walked the twisting highway sometimes left flowers at anonymous spots, a quiet tribute to the young woman who never made it home. On social media, groups that had once coordinated volunteer searches evolved into spaces of remembrance. Each year on February 9th, Charli's photo appeared across timelines, her smile bright, her hand resting gently on the curve of her pregnant belly. The Scott family carried on with public events too. Vigils, fundraisers, campaigns for victims' rights. Kimberlin refused to let her daughter's story slip into silence, even if Stephen insisted on it. The appeals process dragged across years. Each motion required hearings, filings, rebuttals. For the Scott family, it was like being tethered to Stephen against their will, unable to move forward, forced to watch as his lawyers searched for loopholes. The defense argued that jurors had been biased, that evidence had been mishandled, that the length of the trial itself created fatigue and doubt. But the courts upheld the conviction. Still, Stephen didn't stop. Another appeal followed, then another. Each one denied. Each one a reminder that, in the American legal system, a conviction is rarely the final word. Behind bars, Stephen became a ghost of sorts. He avoided interviews. He declined to participate in restorative justice programs that would have required him to acknowledge his crimes. For Kimberlin, it was a cruel twist. The man who had taken her daughter's life still retained power. He had the power to speak and give her peace, or the power to remain silent and keep her chained to uncertainty. He chose silence. And so, the years passed, each one marked not by Stephen's life behind prison walls but by the birthdays Charli would never celebrate, the milestones her child would never reach. By 2020, 6 years after Charli's disappearance, Kimberlin often described the experience as carrying a weight that never lessened. "Justice doesn't feel like a finish line," she said in one interview. "It feels like a mountain you have to keep climbing over and over because every time there's an appeal, every time his name comes back, you're pushed back down to the bottom." The weight wasn't only emotional, it was financial, physical, spiritual. Holding vigils, speaking to media, traveling for hearings, it all demanded energy from a family who had already lost so much. But they kept climbing. Because to stop would feel like surrendering Charli's memory. Shadows of appeal. That's how one local journalist described it. The way Stephen's attempts to overturn his conviction stretched across the Scott family's life like a long shadow. Shadows are strange things. They don't weigh anything. They don't cause pain by themselves. But they linger. They distort. They remind you that something dark is nearby, whether you can see it directly or not. For Kimberlin, that shadow never receded. The court had spoken. The jury had decided. But as long as Stephen kept filing appeals, as long as he refused to confess, Charli's story remained unfinished. Justice had been delivered. But peace was still out of reach. The years had passed, but time did not erase the loss. On Maui, the trade winds still swept over the cliffs of Hana Highway. The ocean still roared against the jagged black rock. Tourists came and went, marveling at paradise. But for the Scott family, paradise had been forever fractured. Charli Scott was gone. Yet she was also everywhere. In the photos that hung in her mother's home. In the soft paw prints of her loyal dog, who had been found alive in the early days of the search. In the memories of laughter at birthday parties and family dinners. And in the unyielding love that carried her family forward, even when grief tried to drag them under. Kimberlin Scott, once just a private mother, became something else in the years after her daughter's murder. An advocate, a public voice for victims whose stories might otherwise be forgotten. She spoke at vigils for missing women. She gave interviews to local and national media, repeating Charli's name so that it would not fade into the static of unsolved cases. She organized community events, where friends and strangers alike came together to remember not just the horror of what happened, but the light of who Charli had been. Her mission was simple but profound, to make sure Charli was more than just a headline. People hear murder case, and they think about the crime, the trial, the suspect, Kimberlin explained. But I need them to remember my daughter. Charli was funny, she was strong, she loved animals, she was excited to be a mom. That's the story I want people to hold on to. Charli's case did more than devastate a family, it rattled an entire island. Maui had long prided itself on being a tight-knit community, where everyone seemed to know everyone, where crime rates were lower than on the mainland. The brutality of Charli's disappearance, the details that emerged during the trial, and the failure of law enforcement to act swiftly at first shook public trust. Why had it taken so long for the police to treat her disappearance seriously? Why did it fall to her family to organize the first search parties, to track her digital footprint, to find the evidence that turned the case? In the years that followed, those questions led to pressure on local authorities to change their protocols when women went missing, especially pregnant women or those considered unlikely to vanish by choice. Charli's tragedy became a catalyst for conversations that reached beyond Maui, about domestic violence, about the danger women often face from partners or ex-partners, about how easy it is for pleas for help to be dismissed until it's too late. For Charli's sisters, the grief took on a more personal rhythm. Holidays felt incomplete. Family photos carried a permanent absence. There was always an empty chair, always the awareness of what should have been. Her unborn son, whom she had already begun planning a name for, was another ghost in the room. Each year that passed, the family thought about how old he would have been. His first steps, his first day of school, the way he might have looked like his mother. Losing Charli meant losing two people, her sister once said quietly. It doubled the grief. On the anniversaries of Charli's disappearance, candles flickered on Maui's beaches. Friends, volunteers, even strangers who had once joined the search would gather to honor her. They told stories, about Charli's contagious laugh, about how she loved to cook for friends, about how she never went anywhere without her dogs. Some came to mourn. Others came to heal. In time, Charli became a symbol of resilience. Her story became a cautionary tale, but also a rallying cry, that communities could step in when institutions failed, that love could fuel action, that no daughter should ever be forgotten. Meanwhile, Stephen Capobianco remained behind bars. He never confessed. He never revealed the full truth of what happened that night along Hana Highway. His silence remained a cruel weight for the Scotts, denying them the closure of laying Charli fully to rest. Without her complete remains, they could not perform the rituals of farewell that Hawaiian families hold sacred. But in time, Kimberlin came to see his silence differently. "It shows who he is," she said. "And it shows who we are. He's silence. We're the voice. He's lies. We're the truth. He'll never speak, but we'll never stop speaking." Charli's name joined a growing list of women whose disappearances and murders had exposed systemic gaps in how authorities respond. Her case was cited in advocacy groups pushing for reforms: faster response times in missing person cases, better cooperation between police and families, improved tracking of domestic violence risk factors. For Kimberlin, those reforms became part of her daughter's legacy. "If another woman is taken seriously faster because of Charli, then she didn't die for nothing," she said. Grief never disappeared for the Scotts. It never softened into something easy or bearable. Instead, it became a part of daily life, like the ocean waves that crashed endlessly against Maui's cliffs. But so too did love endure. Love for Charli, remembered in stories and photographs. Love for her unborn son, imagined in the milestones he never reached. Love for one another, the family pulling close to withstand the storms of appeals, headlines, and anniversaries. On the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, Kimberlin stood on a beach with a candle in her hand. Around her, dozens gathered in silence. The ocean stretched dark and vast behind them, the sound of waves crashing like a heartbeat. She raised the candle. "My daughter's name is Charli Jo Scott," she said firmly, her voice carrying into the night. She was 27 years old. She was 5 months pregnant. And she was loved more than words can say. The crowd repeated softly, "She was loved." And in that moment, Charli's legacy was clear. She was not just a case, not just a victim, not just evidence in a trial or a name in an appeal. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother-to-be. She was a young woman with a future stolen, but a memory fiercely protected. Her legacy was not defined by the man who took her life. It was defined by the family and community who refused to let her story end. Paradise still carries shadows. But in those shadows, light can persist. Charli Jo Scott's light burns on, in her family's fight for justice, in the reforms her case helped inspire, in the candles lit each year on the shores of Maui. She is gone, but she is not forgotten. And as long as her name is spoken, her legacy endures. If this case struck a chord with you, if you believe stories like Charli's deserve to be heard and never forgotten, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Every time you share or comment, you help keep these victims' names alive and you remind the families that the world is still listening. Justice doesn't end with a verdict. It ends when the truth is known. And to Charli Scott's family, we haven't forgotten. We never will.